Lisa walked down the empty sidewalk, the cold night air biting at her skin. She wrapped her thin coat around herself, but it did little to stop the chill from seeping into her bones. The city around her was alive with distant sounds, cars honking, people laughing from inside restaurants, music drifting through the streets. But for Lisa, the world felt quiet, lonely. Her stomach growled, a painful reminder of how long it had been since she had eaten a proper meal. She had spent her last few dollars on a loaf of bread and a carton of milk for her son, hoping it would be enough to last a few days. She clutched the small grocery bag in her hands, the plastic crinkling as she walked. Her feet ached from standing all day at the diner, her back sore from carrying heavy trays. The exhaustion was overwhelming, but she couldn't stop. She had to keep going, keep pushing forward for her son. Everything she did was for him. As she passed by the dimly lit storefronts, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass. Dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled into a messy ponytail, the same coat she'd been wearing for years, one that no longer kept her warm. She looked tired, worn out, barely holding on. She let out a heavy sigh and turned away, focusing on the path ahead. Her thoughts raced with worries. Rent was due in a few days, and she didn't have enough to cover it. The bills were piling up. The landlord had already given her a warning last month. If she didn't come up with the money soon, she and her son would have nowhere to go. She blinked back tears, forcing herself to stay strong. Crying wouldn't solve anything. She reached into her pocket, pulling out the few crumpled bills she had left, barely enough for bus fare and maybe a cheap meal. She shoved the money back into her pocket, swallowing the lump in her throat. She had learned to stretch every dollar, to make sacrifices to survive, but some nights survival felt impossible. As she continued walking, something caught her eye. A small object on the ground, barely visible under the dim streetlights. She slowed down, her brow furrowing. As she got closer, she realized it was a wallet. Her breath hitched as she bent down, picking it up carefully. The leather was smooth, expensive, not something that belonged to someone struggling like her. Her heart pounded as she hesitated, looking around. The street was empty. No one was searching for it. No one had seen her pick it up. Her fingers trembled as she flipped it open. The first thing she saw was a thick stack of cash. Her breath caught in her throat. There had to be hundreds, maybe even thousands of dollars inside. More money than she had seen in a long, long time. Her grip on the wallet tightened as her mind raced. This money could change everything. She could pay the rent, buy groceries, get her son the warm winter coat he needed. She could finally breathe, even if just for a little while. Her pulse quickened as she shuffled through the wallet. Credit cards, business cards, an ID. The name and face of a man she didn't recognize. A businessman, judging by the expensive wallet and the corporate cards. He wouldn't even notice the money was gone, would he? People like him had more than enough. Her breathing became uneven as she stared at the cash, her mind battling against itself. She had always believed in doing the right thing. She had been raised to be honest, to never take what wasn't hers, but life had never been this hard before. The temptation clawed at her, whispering that this was a blessing, a chance to finally catch a break. She swallowed hard, gripping the wallet in both hands. Her conscience screamed at her to return it, but the hunger in her stomach, the worry in her heart, begged her to keep it. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. The cold wind blew through the street, sending a shiver down her spine. She glanced up at the night sky, searching for an answer, for a sign. But the only sound was the distant hum of the city, indifferent to her struggle. Finally, she exhaled a shaky breath and clutched the wallet to her chest. She couldn't decide now. She needed to think. She needed time. With one last glance around, she tucked the wallet into her coat pocket and hurried home, her mind a storm of uncertainty. Lisa sat at the small, rickety kitchen table, staring at the wallet as if it were something alive. The dim light above flickered slightly, casting long shadows over the worn wooden surface. Her son, Michael, was asleep in the next room, his soft breathing the only sound breaking the silence. She could see his tiny figure curled up under a thin blanket through the cracked door. The sight made her heart ache. Her hands trembled as she reached for the wallet, her fingers grazing the smooth leather. She hesitated before opening it again. The thick stack of cash stared back at her, crisp bills neatly tucked inside. It felt surreal, like a cruel joke. She had spent so many nights wondering how she would afford rent, how she would buy enough food for her son, how she would keep the lights on. And now, here it was, an answer to her problems, sitting right in front of her. She swallowed hard. Taking the money meant she could finally breathe. She could wake up tomorrow without the crushing weight of financial stress. She could buy Michael the warm jacket she had to leave behind at the store last week. She could fill their fridge instead of rationing out tiny portions of food, hoping to make everything last. Her grip on the wallet tightened, but then her eyes drifted to the ID card still tucked inside. The face of the man in the photo stared back at her. A businessman, well-dressed, polished, successful. His name was Richard Lawson. She flipped through the contents again. Credit cards, business cards, a folded receipt from a high-end restaurant. He had to be wealthy. This amount of money probably didn't even matter to him. Would he even notice it was missing? Would it change his life the way it would change hers? She let out a shaky breath and closed her eyes. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, soft but firm. Integrity is who you are when no one is watching. She had always lived by that. She had taught Michael the same values, even when life had been brutally unfair. She wanted him to grow up knowing that doing the right thing mattered, even when it was hard. But was it fair that she had to struggle while others had more than they could ever need? Her conscience and her desperation waged war inside her. She ran her fingers through her unkempt hair, trying to silence the thoughts swirling in her mind. Maybe this was fate. Maybe she was meant to find this wallet. Maybe it was her turn to catch a break. Her gaze drifted toward the small photograph pinned to the fridge, her and Michael at the park last summer. His smile was wide, innocent, filled with pure joy. He deserved better than this life of constant struggle. He deserved security, happiness, warmth. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes as she picked up her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen, hesitating before she finally typed the name on the ID into a search bar. Within seconds, she found him. Richard Lawson, CEO of a major financial firm. Articles about his company, interviews, pictures of him standing in front of sleek office buildings. She bit her lip, her mind spinning. This wasn't just some ordinary man. He was important, powerful, wealthy beyond imagination. A man who could probably lose this money and never even feel the loss. Her thumb hovered over the call button on one of the business cards she had found inside the wallet. Her heart pounded in her chest. Once she made the call, there was no turning back. She looked at Michael's sleeping form once more. Her decision wasn't just about her, it was about him, the example she set for him, the person she wanted him to become. Before she could change her mind, she pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Her breath hitched when a deep voice answered. "Hello." She swallowed hard. I found your wallet." There was silence on the other end, followed by an exhale of relief. Oh, thank God. I hadn't even realized I lost it yet. Lisa gripped the edge of the table. "I found it on the sidewalk near Maple Street." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Maple Street? I must have dropped it when I got out of the cab." He sounded genuinely surprised. "Thank you for calling. Where can I meet you?" She hesitated, glancing at the money one last time. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest. "There's a cafe on 5th and Elm," she said finally. "I can meet you there tomorrow morning." "Perfect, I'll be there. Thank you again. I really appreciate this." Lisa ended the call, setting the phone down with a heavy sigh. She had done it. She had made her choice. She looked back at the wallet, then at the cracked ceiling of her tiny apartment. Nothing in her life had changed yet. The bills were still there. The fridge was still nearly empty. But somehow, she felt lighter. She stood up, walked to Michael's bedside, and gently brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. He stirred slightly but remained asleep. She smiled softly, whispering to herself, "I hope I made the right choice." Lisa stood outside the cafe, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh coffee and baked bread from inside. She clutched the wallet in her hands, its smooth leather warming slightly from her grip. A part of her still couldn't believe she had made the call. A part of her still questioned if she had done the right thing. She glanced through the glass window of the cafe. Inside, people sat at cozy tables, sipping coffee and laughing over breakfast. Their lives seemed so simple, so carefree. She envied them. She wondered if any of them had ever known what it was like to go to bed hungry, to worry if their electricity would still be on in the morning, to feel the crushing weight of desperation. Her heart pounded as she checked the time on her phone. 9 a.m. He would be here any minute. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The wallet felt heavier in her hands now, as if it carried all the burdens she had been fighting for so long. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, and her breath caught in her throat. The driver stepped out first, opening the door. A man in a tailored coat emerged, adjusting his cufflinks as he scanned the area. He was taller than she had expected, his posture straight, his expression composed. His eyes landed on her, and in that moment she knew it was him, Richard Lawson. He approached her with a polite yet curious expression. "Lisa." She nodded, gripping the wallet tighter before extending it toward him. "I believe this belongs to you." Richard took it from her, his fingers brushing against hers for a brief second. He opened it, his brows lifting slightly as he flipped through the contents. Everything was still there. The cash, the cards, the ID. He looked back up at her, studying her face. "You didn't take anything," he said, almost as if he were surprised. Lisa straightened her shoulders, suddenly feeling small under his gaze. "No, She hesitated, then sighed. "I thought about it. I won't lie. But I couldn't do it." Richard tilted his head slightly, as if trying to understand her. "Why not? You must have needed the money." She swallowed hard, not sure how much to say. "Because it wasn't mine." Her voice was steady, but there was something vulnerable beneath it. "And because I want my son to grow up knowing that doing the right thing matters, even when it's hard." For a moment, he said nothing. He just looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing beyond the tired eyes and worn-out coat. Then, a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "You're a rare person, Lisa." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a checkbook. Lisa's breath hitched as she watched him scribble something down. When he finished, he tore the check from the book and handed it to her. She hesitated before taking it. When her eyes fell on the number, she nearly dropped it. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life, more than enough to cover rent, buy food, and start fresh. Her hands trembled as she looked back at him. Her voice broke, emotions swelling inside her. "I can't take this." "Yes, you can," Richard said, his tone firm but kind. "You earned it. Not just for returning my wallet, but for proving that good people still exist in the world." Tears welled in her eyes, and she quickly blinked them away. No one had ever helped her like this before. No one had ever looked at her and seen more than just a struggling single mom trying to survive. Richard glanced at his watch before looking back at her. "If you ever need anything, call me." He handed her a business card, then gave her a final nod before turning toward his car. Lisa stood frozen, watching as he disappeared into the vehicle and drove away. She looked down at the check in her hands, her vision blurred with tears. This moment, this one act of honesty, had changed everything. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were finally going to be okay.